Good morning, everyone. This is Bill Lougheed here, Executive Director of Georgian Bay Land Trust. I want to welcome you, everyone, to the first LandMark Speaker Series this year. I'm delighted to see so many participants here today. I'm sorry we can't gather as we usually do, person to person, but at least we can do it this way. Times of COVID are unusual times for all of us. But perhaps there's a silver lining in that it takes us back perhaps to our roots, to things that are important, such as family, such as healthcare workers and doctors and frontline food providers that really are at the roots of everything we do, including that aspect of our lives which involves our roots in Georgian Bay. So thank you for joining us today. In particular, I want to thank our sponsor, Mark Payne of Payne Marine in Point of Barrel, whose generous support allows our land trust to continue its important work in protecting and preserving the wilderness lands of Georgian Bay. So thanks very much, Mark and family. I also want to take a moment just to let you know that your commitment to the Georgian Bay Land Trust as a supporter is making an impact, not just today, but for future generations. So let's just have a quick look at what your contribution has done so far, especially in 2019. Together last year, we added 4 new conservation reserves, bringing our total to 61 nature reserves that collectively protect over 7,300 acres. In 2019, we launched a 4-year collaborative project with the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, Chewanik First Nation, and Magnetawan First Nation to protect and recover species at risk throughout the biosphere and eastern Georgian Bay. GBLT's role in that is to produce a natural area conservation plan, mapping out important habitat types and connecting these to delineated natural corridors for species movement and viability. The conservation planning you help fund will inform municipalities and all users on how to preserve our coast for the decades to come. So now, in terms of getting back to our roots and to simpler times, perhaps, which this pandemic has taken us to, this talk today by Sean Tamblyn will focus on those roots those cultural roots on Georgian Bay, in terms of his stunning photography about the historic lighthouses on Georgian Bay. These are part of our roots and they're part of our culture, and Sean's passion and enthusiasm for these landmarks is incredible. So over to you, Sean, for what I know will be a delightful presentation.
Beautiful, thank you, Bill. And I gotta say, looking at the chat window that just came up, we're incredibly well represented for pretty much all areas that we're going to cover today. I haven't seen that many people talk about Killarney or the Bustards before. Usually people talk about the more southern areas, so that's pretty excellent. My name is Sean Tamblyn. I'm a professional photographer with a specialty in the landscape and wildlife of the granite portion of Georgian Bay. And in 2018, through the Land Trust, I was granted the King Family Bursary, which helped to assist in my ongoing project, the Georgian Bay Lighthouse Survey. The Georgian Bay Lighthouse Survey aims to document through photography all of the lighthouses of eastern Georgian Bay. And the reason I'm doing that is essentially because the Coast Guard doesn't want them anymore. Technically, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. A light on a steel tower can do the job just as efficiently as one of these lighthouses that were all constructed at the turn of the last century. Now, in 2008, the Heritage Lighthouse Protection Act was passed, and in 2010, it came into force. And almost immediately, the Coast Guard termed hundreds of lighthouses across Canada to be surplus, including every single lighthouse in Georgian Bay. They just don't want them anymore. The protection part of it does provide a mechanism whereby a lighthouse can be transferred to a third party if they're armed with a business plan to bring the lighthouse back to its original condition, to maintain it to heritage status, to maintain it to heritage standards, and to provide public access, which means expensive things like staffing and docks. So it's a pretty big lift. Now, this was all supposed to have been said and done by 2015. Technically, the nominations for heritage status, that was closed back in 2012. Since 2015, we haven't really heard a peep. To this date, only 16 lights in Ontario have been granted heritage status, and only one in Georgian Bay, Snug Harbor, up near Parry Sound. So right now we're in a bit of a limbo as to what's going to happen with these lights. So I felt it was important to get out there and to document the condition and the environment around them in case we lose any, and we've already lost one. So these are all the lights in Georgian Bay. These are all the ones that were declared surplus on both sides. These are all the lights that were successfully nominated for heritage status by 2012. And this is the only one that's been granted status. This is Snug Harbor. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a little run up the East Coast from Cottage all the way up to French River and take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of these lights. Now, in the chat window, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat window, and then we'll go through them at the end of the presentation, and I'll address them as best I can. Now, I've been very lucky just recently to spend time up on the Mink Islands and near Parry Sound and in Sans Souci. And I know many of you probably haven't been able to get to your properties yet because of everything that's going on, but it's a great year for hummingbirds. So keep your eye open for the ruby throats. They're just fantastic this year. We're going to start with the bad news. This is Hope Island. And what you can see on the left is what was, and what you can see on the right is what is. And this is the light on a tower that I'm talking about. The original lighthouse is now gone. It was torn down in 2017, and all that remains is the skeletal tower, which is potentially the future of a number of lights on Georgian Bay. Not very aesthetically pleasing. You can see that by the time that I visited it, the light was already in terrible shape. And if it looks funny, it's because the lantern room was removed years ago. So it's already a truncated tower. Internally is just a disaster. Between weather and vandals, it's unlikely that it could have been saved even if the attempt was made. Holes in the floor, windows blown out. Absolute shame for a once proud structure. This is looking up at where the lantern room would have been. It was covered at one point, but Georgian Bay weather tore it to shreds, and the entire building has been open to the element for years. And like I said, it's been completely removed, including the original lighthouse keeper's cottage, which was on the property. And now there's nothing left but this tower. So that's the bad news. We've lost one lighthouse so far. On a brighter note, if we jump over to Brebeuf Island, just off of Beausoleil Island, we have this beautiful little light, which is still an active Coast Guard station. And it was originally moved here from the Jin Islands. Absolutely fantastic. The only lighthouse that you'll see flags flying from. And Brebeuf Island happens to be home to one of the Land Trust Modus tracking towers. These towers track migratory birds up and down the bay. So this light, I would say, has a very good chance of being saved because of its proximity to a national park, a Coast Guard station, and Cognition, which is fairly densely populated. So I don't think Brebeuf is going anywhere anytime soon. But now we're going to head offshore to the Western Island Group, which is about 20 kilometers to the west of the mouth of 12 Mile Bay, to Doubletop Island. And here is a lighthouse that's not looking so good. The foundations are crumbling. The siding is being blown off. The windows are rotting and falling in. And the interior has pretty massive water damage. Now, one of my neighbor's fathers was one of the last keepers here back in the 50s, Lloyd McAuliffe, and it gives me a giggle to think that he might have made his coffee here some days. This room is interesting because if you look at the walls, you can see what looks like siding, but that's not siding, that's stacked 2x10s, which extends 2 stories tall. The walls are completely solid, and I've never seen that much lumber outside of a Home Depot. But to tell you how remote this lighthouse is. This is in the kitchenette and someone has spilled popcorn who knows how many years ago. And not a thing has touched it. Even the mice have forsaken Double Top Island. The second floor has storm windows blown in. And the view looking back to the nearest land, looking straight to the east, the land is purely on the horizon. This light is so remote, it's impossible to imagine that any organization could maintain public access to this if they could afford to build it back up. This is the entirety of the island that you're looking at. There's really almost nothing there. And there's a great story from one of the keepers that kind of went a little crazy one season. And he requisitioned 20 gallons of green paint and a lawnmower from the Coast Guard to try to give him something to do. I had an argument with a friend out here once about how deep the water was. I thought it was 5 feet. He thought it was 10 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet. Finally getting tired of it, I threw a line over the side and it was 30 feet deep. The water out here is so clear, it makes a perfect lens. But despite the decrepitude, this octagonal building is still absolutely stunning. They don't make things like this anymore. And if you can get there at the right time, the visuals are nothing but stunning. A beautiful fall high pressure day, not a thing in the sky. In the middle of winter in January, looking south, this is frozen all the way over between Midland and Owen Sound, and there's nothing there but the open leads of the water. And this is the kind of shot that I'm really aiming to get, something that shows the lighthouse in its natural environment. This is a minus 25 cold snap, and the bay is turning to steam, and the sun is rising and coming through the steam. What the island is covered here is actually frost, not ice, as it freezes to anything that it touches. So an absolutely glorious structure if you ever get the chance to get out there, because I can't imagine this light being saved for much longer, despite the fact that it helped to define shipping into and out of Midland. Now we're going to head inland through 12 Mile Bay. And like I said earlier, one of the things that I do is wildlife photography. And here we're going to run into a fabulous loon and its chick in 12 Mile Bay. I love those wing feathers. And in Sans Souci, we have an enterprising cottager that's actually made a bunkie in the shape of a lighthouse. And there's a bit of a history of faux lights in Georgian Bay. This one is Sans Souci, this one in Parry Sound, and this one up in Key River. But this is the most authentic one with an actual lamp up top, lead glass, and copper roofing. It's a beautiful little structure. It must have taken ages to build. It's very, very detailed. Now we're gonna head north through the Massasauga, and we're gonna take a break here on in the Cathcart Islands and wait for some Georgian Bay weather to pass. If you've been out offshore, you know exactly what those clouds mean. And around the corner, we have Jones Island, and we're now near Parry Sound. And Jones Island is the sister light to Snug Harbor. And these are the twin ranges along with the Red Rock Lighthouse that help to guide boats into Snug Harbor. Jones sits quite high in the landscape and has a very commanding view of the entire area around it. Inside, we see a standard paint job for Georgian Bay lights, which is blue, this would have been the living room, and yellow. Colors to help to keep the keepers of old cheery on those grayer days, because these keepers would stay into November. And in Georgian Bay, November, the shoulder seasons can be really serious out there. You can see the beams that they would construct this with. They don't make trees like this anymore. These are absolutely massive. And in the background there, you can see sawdust. The ants are doing a real number on this building. So it would take an expert to get in here to see if this building can be saved. It looks like it's in good condition, but if the bones ain't good, you know, who knows how long it's gonna last. The stairs are very solid. The tower is in quite excellent shape for something that was built in the late 1800s. And this is the range light that points out to the Gordon Rocks, lovingly dabbled with spider poop. Now, this is what I like to call a bursary shot. There are certain images here that you'll see that the bursary directly helped to make happen. To see the full moon rising in a specific place at a specific time takes an awful lot of planning and timing within about 30 seconds. And you have to be within about 10 feet of the right place to be with the right lens. So this one took a long time to get. This is the full moon rising behind Jones Island. So thank you to the King family for helping to make some of these images actually possible. Another beautiful blue sky day. If you ever get the chance, there's no dock here, but it's not very hard to land. It's well worth visiting this light. This is the range light for Jones. This is the Gordon Rocks, which is with this very distinctive paint job. It always makes me think of the Joker from a deck of cards for some reason. Nothing else, I don't think, is painted this way on the bay. It's very distinctive. And while we're out here, I ran into this beautiful eastern fox snake testing the waters. It's a beautiful high pressure system. The water is absolute glass, and you can see the surface tension around it. A very, very lucky shot. Now on the North Shore is Snug Harbor. This is the sister light to Jones. And this is the previous owners of Georgian Bay Airways. They owned a de Havilland Beaver, beautiful plane from the 1950s. Here it is on step in front of Snug Harbor, which itself was built in the late 1800s. So an ancient plane in front of an even more ancient building. Surprising that they're both standing and flying. Sadly, they sold the plane because that plane had an awful lot of character, I'll tell you. Gorgeous reflections at sunset. Absolutely fantastic. Now, this was taken just last week, and this is the good news of our presentation, is that not only is Snug the only light to be granted heritage status, but they've secured funding to begin restoration of the interior. So they've boarded up the doors and windows in preparation for this work with this, very gaily painted red color. And I'm going to get in there to document the current, meaning the before, the state that it's in now. We'll let them do their work, and then I'll go back in to show the afterwards. So the Georgian Bay Lighthouse Survey is beginning to have a bit of history behind it now as the structures slowly change themselves and the landscape around them. Heading out from Snug Harbor, we passed Franklin Island and the White Pine Reserve. This is one of my favorite places in Georgian Bay, back to the chatting earlier. This is Henrietta Point, and Henrietta is home to some absolutely spectacular sunsets. In case you're wondering, I don't do Photoshop. None of these are, nothing added, nothing taken away. Anything that you see here is actually what it looked like. Now, this is the anchor of the entire system. This is the Red Rock Lighthouse at the very southern end of the Mink Island chain, and directly offshore from Parry Sound. Just keep going and you'll run into Red Rock. And Red Rock is the third structure to be built, not exactly on this island. The previous one was on Old Tower Island, just to the north. But that's how tough Georgian Bay winters are. That they attempted to build 2 lighthouses, and Georgian Bay said, ain't gonna happen. It's very much an active aid to navigation. As you can see, a bulk carrier here heading into Parry Sound. And that's the entirety of the island taken from the air on a Georgian Bay Airways flight last year. That's it. On a good day, you can just barely walk around the tower. So these keepers of old, they were a different breed. They didn't have the internet and cell phones to distract them. There's nothing to do there but what you take with you. The keepers on Double Top were 20 kilometers offshore, and that would make landing incredibly difficult. At least these guys were relatively close to Parry Sound and the Minks, which was very active back in the day. Now, this is what I'm talking about, a Georgian Bay winter. This is a January storm and a wave breaking against the granite that the lighthouse sits on. in the 70s, this helicopter landing pad was added, and that's about 70 feet above the waterline. So this one wave is throwing spray over 70 feet in the air. I can only imagine that the entire building must reverberate like a drum during these big storms. This was also just taken last week, and you can see how deep the entryway is. That's about 6 feet thick. That's the foundation of the building, which is 6 feet of concrete wrapped in bolted steel. It is built like a bank vault. Looking due west, you can see the bolts. And this is the old helicopter landing pad. And when a helicopter would land, the rotors would be literally inches away from this steel wall. So very little margin of error, which is why they added the landing pad up top. Now, the first floor of this is pretty dank. You can see the old chimney there where the stove would have been. Place is a mess. Second floor is has a beautiful wraparound workbench that, as a mechanic myself, kind of makes me weep a little bit. That is a glorious workbench. These are the supports for the old oil drums. The drums are now long gone, but the supports are still in place. And there you can see the chimney rising again on the left-hand side there. There's a glorious wrought iron staircase, spiral staircase that takes you up to the third floor. And we simply don't build things like this anymore. There's an aesthetic here from the turn of the century that you just can't duplicate. Here's this now familiar paint job again, this yellow and blue. This would have been a common room. This is upstairs. And you can see that everything's peeling and falling apart. No one bothers to clean these up anymore. There's a beer can there. People go in and party. It's a real shame. But despite the decrepitude, they can be gorgeous. And because the red rock so dominates the horizon that it sits on, it becomes almost a graphical element in any photograph that you want to take. As it happens, the sun is 1 angular degree in diameter, and the red rock is almost exactly the same size. So if you plan your timing and location just right, this is the show that you can see. And to watch the sunset directly behind the lighthouse is a really beautiful thing. There's just nothing else around it. You can't miss it. And this is a very unique set of conditions where the bay has gone almost dead calm, but not quite. So you have striated bands of absolute glass water and other bands with a light ripple on them. And so the blue is reflecting the light of directly above, and the orange is the twilight of sunset. I've only seen these conditions about 3 times in my life out in the bay. And when they happen, it's like seeing a rainbow. It's just absolutely magic. The Red Rock is probably my favorite lighthouse because it's just so unique. Now we're gonna head up the Mink Island chain. I saw somebody mentioned the minks and McCoys earlier. This is on Green Island if you've been there. And I was fortunate enough to be there when a monarch migration flew through. It's one thing to see 1 or 2. It's another thing to see thousands of them. And they were just dripping off the trees. How often have you seen that? Yeah, this branch has room for only 1 more. Now, north of the Minks and the McCoys, and we head inland to Point of Barrel, one of the more famous lighthouses on the bay. And Point of Barrel is the only lighthouse in the bay that is currently staffed. Now, Emmeline Madigan, who is the keeper now, she was there until 1983, and then the lighthouse was de-staffed because, of course, they're all automated now. And Point of Barrel immediately ran into a problem with vandalism. So the Coast Guard brought her back, and she's still there in July and August, making her butter tarts. Here she is in her spotless kitchen. And if you've been into any of the other lighthouses, they're complete disasters. They're musty, moldy, dusty, essentially nasty buildings to be inside. to be inside Point Barrel is really lovely because it's her home and it's clean and spotless and brightly lit. And it really takes you back to what it must have been like 100 years ago when these lights were truly active and you could drop in and visit the keepers of old. She makes the best butter tarts in the bay. So if you're ever in the area, you have to drop in and try them. This particular batch powered me in my kayak all the way from Point Barrel to the McCoys in one go. She uses a lot of sugar. They're so good. Now, the story of Point Barrel, of course, is the barrel. And back in the day, the original light was, theoretically, a barrel with a light in it that would guide the fishermen back in. The barrel eventually faded into history and the modern lighthouse was put up, but someone put the barrel back up. So Point Barrel lives back up to its name again. One of the techniques that I often use is called panoramic photography, and it lets you shoot over 180 degrees this way. And so this is one way of viewing both the lighthouse and the barrel together in one frame. In June, on a clear night, the stars streak overhead. So this is the lighthouse, roughly a 4-hour exposure, and the sheds and pump house down on the right, and they are actually lit by the rising full moon. And you can tour the lighthouse. Emmeline's there, and you can go up top, and this is a view at twilight, taken in both the shed and the lantern room. Absolutely beautiful view on a calm night. This is Georgian Bay at its best. Now heading offshore, we run into a curious American mink, and I always love just how curious they are. They also have this little white patch, and I think I'm starting to look more like a mink every day. Heading up the coast, this is Giroux Island, and Giroux Island is the only other active Coast Guard station on the eastern seaboard of Georgian Bay. Now here you can see some of the siding is missing. That's the east face, at least. But oddly enough, a lot of the damage that seems to happen on the east side of buildings. I think when weather gets really bad, it's the eastern punch that knocks a lot of things out. This is very well maintained with walkways that are in excellent shape. You can walk around the entire thing. This is, if you remember, Braybuff looking quite small. It was only 2 stories tall. This is more normal at 3 stories with the lantern room on top. And just in behind there, you can see the Coast Guard building. This is a view looking to the north, and you can see that even though the siding has been maintained, down at the bottom there, every Georgian Bay winter tries to peel them away. The Coast Guard here is very active, and they'll take the Rescue 9000 here into Little Brit almost daily. So they have a very active presence in the area, and they're quite friendly. And every lighthouse seems to evoke moods. This goes back to the cultural roots. These are a light on a tower just doesn't evoke the same kind of imagery that these structures do. A few years ago, we had a partial solar eclipse, and the positioning was such that it happened right over the lantern room of the Giroux Island light. Now, every lighthouse is situated differently on their island, and some face, kind of southwest, and some face kind of northeast. This one in particular had the exact positioning to have the eclipse right over top of the lantern room. And this was a beautiful way to spend an afternoon and watch this particular show happen. Absolutely gorgeous. There again, you can see the siding missing, which has already since been replaced. Now we head across the McNab Rocks. This is the mouth of Byng Inlet, and we run into, of all things, on the pure Canadian Shield, a burrowing animal. How does a groundhog possibly survive out here where there's nowhere to burrow? Lots of grass to eat, but Georgian Bay is always full of mysteries, to be sure. A small black bear. And I say small, of course, even small ones are quite large, but the large ones are really large. So this one was a little younger, a little less cautious, and a little more curious, and happily posed for the camera after digging through the underbrush. And you can see just covered in spider webs. Now you could use a good hairbrush. But after not being able to visit a hair salon in so long, I think we all probably could use a hairbrush. As we reach the northern side of Georgian Bay, this is the Outer Fox Islands, particularly the shirt tails that sits in front of them. And the granite becomes much smoother and more sculpted. This is more like Killarney now. We're up in the very northeast corner of the bay, and you can see the Bustard Islands off in the distance there. This is late twilight on a very calm night. And as we get closer to the Bustard Islands, this is the view that you'll see of the lighthouse and Twin Ranges on the Bustard Rocks. And as far as I know, these are unique pretty much anywhere in the world. I haven't seen anything quite like this. This is the view to the west, and the lighthouse, the range in front of you here, would have guided ships out of the French River system. So you line up the range with the light, and that guides you out. A view from the east, and this is the range that would guide you in. And this would have transported lumber out of the French River system and coal to Key River, where it will get taken by rail further north. This is what's called the blue hour. This is about an hour after sunset. Very peaceful night. This is another Bursary shot. This is the Perseids at about 2 in the morning over the lighthouse and ranges, and we get about 5 bursts here. It wasn't the clearest night because that's just what happens. You never know what you're going to get. It wasn't bad, but as a photographer, we're always looking for true perfection. Now, the interior of the tower is a mess, like the rest of them. Graffiti, lumber strewn around. But it doesn't look like it's in bad shape. It is a mess, though. An absolute mess. This is the actual light itself. And interestingly, it's the only light that rotates of all the ones that we've seen today. The rest of them are fixed. So why exactly this one rotates, I don't know. It would take a marine historian to answer that. But look at the spider webs. The Coast Guard doesn't even bother to clean it. So you can still see the light, but it really needs some Windex. This is an absolute mess. Now the ranges, you can see that the shingling on the roofing is starting to go. And again, you can see the details that they built all of these structures with. Once you lose much more of this roof and the weather gets in, who knows how long this light can survive. I can't imagine anyone being able to maintain public access to a location like this. This is so remote and so inhospitable. They used to keep chickens here, though, back in the day. So you could have dropped in for fresh eggs, but now there's nothing there but the light and ranges. This is late twilight. This is going back already. This is in 2011. One of my favorite shots, showing all 3 of them from the water's surface. You can really see they're pretty clean. They're not bad. So in terms of restoring this structure, that wouldn't be too hard, but maintaining access, almost impossible. And that is our quick tour for today. That takes us up the entire coastline. And that is a bunch of imagery from the Lighthouse Survey. I have lots more, but we have to keep things relatively short. And you can follow me on Instagram at Heart of Stone Photo. And you can also find me online at www.heartofstonephoto.com. And that is my larger Georgian Bay project beyond just lighthouses. So thank you very much. And if we have any questions, we'll try to answer them for you.
Thanks so much, Sean. Before we go to the questions, we're just going to quickly hand it over to Janet here, who has some closing remarks in case anyone has to leave us, and then we'll go back to Sean for some questions. So here's Janet.
Thank you, Sean. That was an amazing array of photographs along the bay, some of which many of us have never seen. So kudos to you. Just a few closing remarks. This summer may feel a little different to all of us, but please know that we are a strong land trust and we're continuing our conservation work along the bay, obeying all the rules and the guidelines as recommended by health experts. So please check our website for any updates as it relates to COVID. We are also so grateful to see so many of our loyal supporters here this morning. This is an extraordinary time and the demand on your resources is very unique. So we do hope that you will continue to support us. And for any new attendees here, new to the GBLT, we please ask you to put us on your consideration list for your charity dollars this year. Our next Landmark Speaker Series is Saturday, June 25th at 10 a.m. June 27th at 10 a.m. where Dr. Pat Chow-Fraser will talk to us about turtles, country turtles, city turtle, keeping them in a safe and changing world. So please make sure that you sign up online so we can send you the link. All the details of this, of course, are on our website. Thanks, everyone. For those of you who are in the Bay, enjoy your day on the Bay. For the rest of us, stay safe in the city. And now back to Sean for some questions and answers.
All right, thanks, Janet. So again, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box and I will be monitoring that and asking them to Sean. So we're gonna start off here. Sean, Bonnie had a question. How do you take the winter photos?
The winter photos, sometimes we actually do go out into the bay when it freezes properly. Sometimes, some years you get good ice, some years you get bad ice. But some of those shots in particular, like the ones at Double Top, those are remote cameras. I was fortunate enough to document the last 4 space shuttle launches. And to document a space shuttle launch, you have to have a camera that lives out in the swamp or on the launch pad for upwards of a week at a time. So I brought that technology back to Georgian Bay, and those cameras will be out there in an environmental enclosure for up to 6 months at a time with a timer and a solar panel. So it's a big installation to put out there, and they happily click away in all weather, and every once in a while they get gold. So remote cameras is the answer.
All right, and we had another question from Paul, who's wondering if you could talk a little more about the status of the Gordon Rocks Lighthouse.
Well, so technically it's a range, not a lighthouse, but as far as I know, everything has been nominated. Now, let me answer that later. I have to go and specifically check that one to see if it's been nominated. But it, like all other lights, even if it has been nominated, is sitting in limbo because only Snug has been granted heritage status. And what is currently happening with the rest of the lights is really anybody's guess. So that's a tough one, but I will look up the actual heritage status for you later on.
Okay, several people are wondering if you're going to make a book out of these photos.
I am, and the book is actually called Heart of Stone. And if you've ever seen a tree in Georgian Bay fall over, there's almost always a stone right in the middle of the root bundle that the tree carries over with it. So I thought Heart of Stone was an appropriate name since it's a pure granite landscape. So yes, there is a book forthcoming, and I'm almost ready to start producing it.
All right, and so Catherine is wondering if for the lighthouses that won't be saved, is there a possibility of salvaging any of the components?
That's a fine question, and only the Coast Guard could answer that. I have absolutely no idea. I know that when they put the tower up on Hope, they removed the lantern room, and even the Coast Guard in Perry Sound has the lantern room of another lighthouse. I forget which one exactly, which they use as their guardhouse. So it would be hoped that some of the more important aspects of these lights, like the lanterns and the entire top of them, would get to go to museums in the area. One can only hope, but of course that costs money. And whether there's any kind of a budget to salvage these, to bring in cranes out to Giroux Island here to attempt to pull this lantern off, I really have no idea. And that's part of why I'm doing this, is because everything is really just a big question mark. So I personally would like to see these things saved, but there's absolutely no guarantee that that will happen.
Okay, next question. Susan is wondering why Snug is the only lighthouse that has received historic designation.
Also a good question, and also a big question mark. The process is fairly opaque, and only 16 lights in Ontario have been granted status. So exactly who gets done in what order, I have absolutely no idea. I expect that the Carling Township was behind it, and because it's really close to land there, it's really easy to get to. It's probably one of the simplest lights to maintain access to, and it's also in good shape, so wouldn't require much restoration. So in terms of the project of taking over the light, it might have been the easiest one. Something like the Busted Rocks, you know, good luck. That's going to be really tough to prove that you can actually keep that accessible.
All right, thanks. Peter's wondering if the Georgian Bay Land Trust has considered taking on any of these lighthouses.
So I do believe that at one point they did, and at one point that they actually had a nomination in for for Brebeuf Island, but something happened because it's an active Coast Guard station. So perhaps while we're on the call, they can answer that for us.
Yeah, I think I'll just speak to that briefly. We did look into it a number of years ago. I wasn't personally involved in that, and the requirements from the government were extreme in the sense of having to maintain, having to put docks in, having to offer public access, and at the time it wasn't feasible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible going forward. I think that's the short answer to that. Okay.
I should also mention that many of the sites are technically contaminated.
Right.
A lot of the paints that were used way back in the day contained lead, and you'll find old bits of batteries and things, and it's unclear who's going to decontaminate the sites, whether the federal government will step in and do that, or whether the person or entity that takes over the light will have to do that themselves. And that adds to the complication of doing this.
Right, thanks, Sean. Lucinda's wondering if you could tell us what the difference is between a range and a lighthouse.
A range, technically Snug Harbor is a range. It is a light that focuses in only one place, whereas a lighthouse, like Giroux here, it casts a beam over a very wide area. So most of the other lights that you saw are visible. Something like the Red Rock is visible 360 degrees. Snug Harbor or Jones are only visible when you're actually in the appropriate alignment. So a range is unidirectional, and a lighthouse like Giroux here is multi-directional.
All right, thank you. Adam is wondering how many nights a year you go camping to take these photos.
In the last couple of years, I've been very lucky, and I've probably spent last year, probably cumulatively, almost 2 months over the course of the entire season. I start my season very early and I go very late. And typically I'm pinning a poppy on my life jacket because it's Remembrance Day. It's usually around when I start to wrap up my season. So I've been fairly lucky, and a lot of these shots just take that long to wait for the right conditions to happen.
Okay, Susan has a question. Will the Coast Guard allow cottage associations to restore any of these lighthouses and keep them up?
I think any group or entity would be allowed to do that. And, but you have to go through the nomination process and give them the business plan that proves that you can do it. Now, the nomination period closed back in 2012, but it's unclear whether that means that you can attempt to do it again or not. Again, a question mark. I'm not entirely sure. But if any cottage association has already put a nomination through, then they're in a good position to start the process.
And Ross is wondering, for the lights that aren't maintained, is the plan to just let them gradually degrade, or what will happen to them?
Well, another question mark. Hope Island, that land has reverted back to the First Nations down there, so it had to be removed. What would happen to, say, Giroux here if it didn't get granted status? I'm going to say that they would probably tear them down. And they did that with all of the other structures. A lot of these buildings had associated dwellings, like one on Doubletop, dwellings and boathouses and sheds, and they went in and they cleared them all away. So I would expect that they would probably tear them down purely for liability. Now, something like the Red Rock, which is built literally like a bank vault, I don't know how they could do that. I think they'd have to use a small nuclear device to clear the island. It's really built too solidly, but probably tear them down would be my guess.
All right, and we've got time for one more question, which comes from Catherine. She's wondering if there are any plans to exhibit these photos anywhere.
I almost had an exhibit last year at Trestle Brewery in Parry Sound. That would have been fun. But it's very possible that we'll have a show when the book launches, and we'll have a show of the Georgian Bay landscape, wildlife, and lighthouses all at the same time. And that could be next year. So we'll see. There's still a couple more shots that I'm trying to get.
All right, great. And sorry, one more question, wondering about the possibility of purchasing any of the photos from this presentation.
Absolutely. You can find me online through Instagram and through my website. And not just purchasing photos, but if anybody has any other questions or comments or just wants to talk about your local light, you can get me to talk about Georgian Bay all day. So feel free to get in touch with me by email or through Instagram. And maybe some people I know actually have information about what's going on out there. Like I just found out about Snug Harbor getting restored last week. So if any of you know anything, please let me know.
All right, thanks so much, Sean. That's a great ending. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Again, as Janet mentioned, our next speaker series will be June 27th, and you can find information for that and sign up at gblt.org/landmark. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.